lecturer at Stanford University, and he's also a managing director of Alchemist Accelerator. This is a C accelerator backed by Cisco and DFJ. So now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next speaker, Mr. Ravi Belani. Your applause to welcome our speaker. Hello, Ravi.
Hi, Sophia.
Thank you for coming to Taipei. It's your time.
Thank you for having me. Well, first of all, it's an honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you, Holly and TSS, for inviting me. It's been fantastic being in Taipei. And I should say that the reason why I'm here is because I genuinely believe that the next big idea, as Holly was talking about, thinking big, that next big idea is in somebody's mind in this room right now or on Twitch watching remotely. And if I can help catalyze that idea into reality, it's what I exist for. And so today we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about how Silicon Valley thinks. I should say, though, my hope and aspiration is not that we'll have a big Silicon Valley company coming out of Taipei or Taiwan, but really my hope is that Taiwan will disrupt Silicon Valley and that you will really approach entrepreneurship in the true spirit of entrepreneurship and doing things that are bigger and bolder than what we can even conceive about in Silicon Valley. Having said that, what I'd love to do is just first see who's here. So how many people right now are currently founders of startups? Or just raise your hand if you're a founder of a startup. Okay, how many people want to be a founder in a startup or are thinking about starting a company? Okay, how many people are working at a corporation or have another type of job? Okay, and how many people don't know what they want to do right now in life and they're still trying to figure that out? Okay, I haven't captured about 75% of the audience, so there's some other big category. And how many people are just curious, are here just watching out of curiosity? Okay, well, fair enough. Well, today we're going to cover a couple topics, and I hope some of these will be interesting and stimulating. Let me start off by giving my background. So I, as Sophia mentioned, have a couple hats. Let me see, am I standing out of the way? Okay. The first is that I spent 6 years as a venture capitalist at DFJ. And the two big unicorn companies that I funded at DFJ, one was Twitch. So I was the second institutional investor in the precursor to Twitch, which was called Justin TV. And as Holly mentioned, Twitch was actually a failure that became Twitch. So the first incarnation was Justin TV, which then became Twitch, and then ultimately also had another company called Justin TV as well. And I was the first institutional investor in that company, or the second, and then ultimately Twitch got sold to Amazon for $970 million. I also funded a company called Pubmatic, which was a company that came out of Pune, out of India, and is now doing about $500 million in revenue. And we funded Pubmatic at a $4 million valuation as the first investor in Pubmatic. I also teach entrepreneurship at Stanford. And we put all of our lectures up online, and so you're welcome to, it's a great repository of many of the top thought leaders in Silicon Valley, and you can watch the lectures at etl.stanford.edu. And then finally, I direct Alchemist, which is a venture-backed accelerator focused on corporate startups that make money from corporations. B2B startups, or startups where your revenue is coming from corporations. Your users can be consumers, like Google. You could be an ad network. But if you're monetizing from corporates, Alchemist is particularly relevant. So let me tell you about Alchemist very quickly. The way the program works is that we give you a little bit of money. We give around $36,000, and we bring you to San Francisco or Palo Alto for 6 months. Alchemist is our backers, the people that give us money, are many of the top venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. Khosla Ventures, DFJ, US Venture Partners, Mayfield, Foundation. And then we also have a bunch of corporates that back us as well. Some are on this slide, including Salesforce and Cisco and Siemens and SAP. And we've just announced a bunch of other corporates that have joined as backers of Alchemist as well. We're very honored that Alchemist is famous for being the top accelerator when it comes to median funding rates. So CB Insights rated all the accelerators in 2016 based on the median levels that the graduates fundraised at. And Alchemist was number 1, Y Combinator is number 2, Techstars is number 3, and 500 Startups is number 4. We internally think that fundraising is just one metric of success. We say internally you get 1 point for fundraising, you get 100 points for closing your first customer, and 1,000 points for building a sales engine. So we don't want to confuse fundraising with success, but it is one easy thing to measure that people are sensitive about. And these are some of the stats. We've had 159 companies go through the program that are at least 6 months out post the program. 89 have closed institutional rounds. The average raise is $2.6 million, and 15 of the companies have been acquired. And so that's Alchemist. And so if you are interested in, if you're starting a company, we'd urge you to apply. You can just check us out online at alchemistaccelerator.com. We have our next deadline is actually this week, I think on Saturday, for the class that's going to start in August. But today what we're going to talk about is how to build billion-dollar businesses, or how to think about what's the difference between building a good business versus a business that creates $1 billion in market value. And one of the principles that I want to start out with is part of this is captured by Archimedes, who famously said, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I can move the earth." The notion there being that if you architect something in the right way, for the same effort, you can have a dramatically different impact. The other way of saying that was phrased by Ben Horowitz, who's a partner at Andreessen Horowitz, who's also wrote a fantastic book called The Hard Things About Hard Things. And Ben has said it takes as much work to build a mediocre startup as it does to build a change the world startup. And so you might as well go big. I can assure you that if you talk to any startup that's struggling, they're not working less. They're working even harder probably. And so if you're going to work hard anyways, if you're going to give it your all, the philosophy of this talk is, can you architect your business in certain ways so that you can go even bigger, okay? And this is, again, off of what Holly was talking about thinking big and going even bigger. So we're going to start by seeing if there's inspiration from the venture capital community in doing this. What's amazing about venture capital in the United States is that literally a very small amount of cash, 0.2% of our GDP is spent on venture capital. And yet it has produced companies that generate a fifth, 20% of the GDP in the United States. And so the question is, what's the secret sauce or the magic behind those investment dollars in? And in the US, we call these unicorns. I don't know why we have come up with that term, because they're not fake, they're real. But I guess because of the rarity, we have this phrase of $1 billion of value is building a unicorn. And these are the unicorns that were produced before the hype period. Right now, people say that the number of on-paper valuations is fake. It's overinflated. But if you look at I think this is up until 2010, these were the 40 companies that were produced in the first decade of the 2000s that were worth $1 billion or more. And as you can see, Facebook was the clear disproportionate winner. But the big takeaway here is at steady state, there's around 4 companies a year that get started that end up becoming worth $1 billion. That number could be more generous if you account for the period over the last 7 years where we've seen a lot of companies, but it's between 4 and 10 companies a year safely become worth $1 billion. So it's not an easy challenge. Of the thousands of companies a year, only 4 to 10 become worth $1 billion. And the question is, what makes those take off? So the key insight here is that if you're going to build a company that's going to be worth $1 billion, you cannot architect it in a way where its growth is linear. It has to be architected to grow exponentially. Linearly means if I walk linearly, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you're walking on an exponential curve, we're talking about 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. An exponential curve just grows multiplicatively, where if you architect something so that your value driver is growing multiplicatively versus linearly, you are on a path where you can build $1 billion worth of value. One way to see this is to look at the growth of the internet. This is the growth of the internet since 1966 to 2001, to the beginning of the new millennium. And this looks like a regular, pretty predictable line. But that y-axis is a logarithmic scale. It's an order of magnitude for each line. It's going up by 10x. And if we plot this on a linear scale, that y-axis, it looks like this, where it looks like in the late 90s, something dramatically different happened, where you're just coasting along and then suddenly, whoa, things took off. And the reality is that nothing actually dramatically changed in terms of how the internet was building itself. From the beginning, it was on an exponential curve. It just felt like something dramatic happened, but it's actually been architected in a way to build itself non-linearly. So, if you're going to grow to $1 billion in 5 to 10 years, these are you need to, if you want to grow to $1 billion in 10 years, you need to be doubling in value every year. And this is just math. If you're going from $1 million valuation to $1 billion valuation, if you have to have 1,000x growth, you need to either double in 10 years, or at the limit, if you want to do something in 5 years, you can do that if you 4x your growth rate every year. But basically, you need to be growing at a multiplicative rate, at least doubling every year to get to $1 billion of value. Okay? And that's just math. But what we're going to talk about now, and these are the different curves. Everybody understands the difference between linear and exponential growth. So what I want to talk about now is what are some of the ways that you can architect your startup to grow multiplicatively, to grow exponentially. And we're going to talk about 3 drivers that most venture capitalists will key in on when they're evaluating or assessing a company. Just basic principles. The first is business models, okay? So if one of the classic things that venture capitalists will ask you for is what are the gross margins of your business? And the reason why is because it has an impact on you growing multiplicatively. As an example, if it costs you 50 cents to make a, what is it? Is it xiaolongbao? What's the soup dumpling called? Which is, I just went to Din Tai Fung, and I had those shrimp. But let's say it cost 50 cents to make a shrimp dumpling, and you can sell a shrimp dumpling for $1, okay? You make a profit of 50 cents on that $1 sell, which means that you can produce 1 more dumpling. You sell that for $1, and you make 50 cents. But you'll notice if my margins are 50%, I'm just producing enough to produce 1 more unit, but I'm never growing, okay? But if instead I go and I sell, so this is at 50 cents, 50% margins. But let's say now I go to the Din Tai Fung in Taipei 101, where all the tourists are. And instead of charging $1, I charge $1.50 for that dumpling. Okay, suddenly it costs me 50 cents. I charge $1.50. I make $1, which means I get to produce 2 dumplings. I sell those 2 dumplings, which cost $1 for $1.50 each or for $3, and I make a profit of $2, which means that I can make 4 dumplings. Okay? So just by shifting the margins a little bit, from 50 cents to 67%, from 50% to 67%, I suddenly put myself on a doubling path. Okay? And I can double that by increasing the willingness to pay on my product or by decreasing the costs. If I increase it even more, if I suddenly go to whatever in Taipei is the hottest club, and instead of charging $1.50, I charge $2 for that, I'm at 75% margins, and then suddenly I make $1.50 for every sale, and I can produce 3 dumplings. So I'm at triple just by increasing the margins by 8 cents. So it's a very basic principle, but every incremental cent of margin allows you to grow by an even stronger multiple. And this is effectively software margins. This is why, if you're producing a hardware company, many venture capitalists, although things are changing, will not want to fund a hardware company because it's capital intensive up front and the margins are low. Whereas software, it doesn't cost anything for Google, but the costs are de minimis to serve up a web page and to serve and for Google to provide you a service. Okay, so that's the first one, is margins. The second thing that you should look for when you're building a startup is that you should be doing something new. You should be building a company that could not have been built 3 years ago because there's a new technology platform that exists today that didn't exist 3 years ago when you are starting the company. If you cannot answer that question, what's new about what you're doing, I would seriously rethink about the idea that you have. Why is that? And it's because technology as a platform fundamentally follows an exponential curve, because the inputs to the next wave of technology are created by the outputs of that technological wave. So the very computers that use the chips are the ones that create the next generation chips for the next generation. So there's a positive feedback loop where technology feeds on itself and it grows multiplicatively. This is Moore's Law. Everybody knows Moore's Law. I take it we're in Taiwan, the land of Moore's Law. So if any country in the world should understand this, it's Taiwan. But for those who don't, Moore's Law is the basic principle that every 18 months, the density of transistors doubles for the same price point. You know this every time you buy a phone. For the same amount of money, that phone seems like it has twice as much functionality as it did before because of Moore's Law. So this Moore's Law has been applies to basically that phenomena can be abstracted to all forms of technology. This is the growth of the internet. This is, again, how we experience the growth of the internet linearly. This is magnetic data storage, which also follows an exponential curve. On the y-axis, we have this here. So basically, the two questions are, one, could this have been done 3 years ago, or are you using some new technology platform? And if you are building something that's not that is trying to be a new technology itself, so you're not riding on a new technology, like Uber was built really off of the ubiquity of mobile phones, but let's say you're creating a new technology, the heuristic that you're going to be asked is that new fundamental innovation or technological innovation, is it 10x better? And why 10x? Because if it's not 10x better, if it's not 10x better, faster, or cheaper, Moore's Law will catch you pretty quickly. So just all things being equal, in 18 months, everything's going to get twice as fast, cheap, and better because of the chips. So for you to have an advantage, you need to be at least 10x better to buy you 3 cycles of Moore's Law, or around 4 to 5 years of advantage. Okay. So, and the really terrific thing about being an entrepreneur today is that even Moore's Law is increasing. And so if you abstract away what this means, if Moore's Law continues as it has continued since the 1900s, Moore's Law has continued on a constant pace. And if you look at that, if you look at the graph for Moore's Law and I say, where was World War I? Or where was World War II? Or where was the financial crisis of 2008? You will notice that Moore's Law keeps on continuing. It's immune to wartime situations or economic conditions, and so it's likely to continue going forward. Assuming it does, what that means is that by 2023, you have the ability to have the whole human brain capability for $1,000. Okay? That drops down to just a penny for a whole human brain by 2037. And then you also have, these are off, but you have the ability to have the whole human race capability for $1,000 by 2049, and you'll have the whole human race's capability of intelligence for a penny by 2059, which is by the time that many of you in this room will just be in your 50s or 60s. So it's profound if you think about what's so much fun about being a founder today is that you're not constrained by your past. You do not have to extrapolate what's going to happen in the future based on what's happening in the past. And everybody who's playing that game is going to be wildly surprised by the founders that take the advantage of just acting and moving. Okay? And we're already seeing this play out in Silicon Valley. So if you see the companies today versus 10 years ago on how quickly they've grown, the revenue ramps, they're 4 to 5x steeper. What that means is that companies are getting to whatever revenue milestone you want, $10 million in revenue, 4 to 5 times quicker than they were 10 years ago. These are a couple companies, and you can see their revenue growth rates. This is the most recent unicorn coming out of Silicon Valley, and how long these, this is, you can see to get to 10 million in revenue, Slack just took 6 months, whereas Box and Yammer, which were the previous record setters, took longer. How many people have heard of Slack? Okay, great. Taiwan is amazing. Okay, so Slack is, our record setter of a company that had the shortest unicorn puberty period. They went from 0 to $1 billion valuation, from launch to $1 billion valuation in 9 months, which is staggering. And the reason why was, even though they were only doing 10 million in revenue at that point, their growth rate was so phenomenally fast that the valuation went up that high. Does that make sense? So how you grow is as important as what you're building. Okay. So the final driver that I want to discuss is network effects. And network effects is a term that's used a lot in Silicon Valley. But a network effect, the idea behind a network effect is building a product that gains more value as users use it. So it's this idea that all of your previous customers or users of a product actually will gain more value from the product as that product grows. And so it's a beautiful, beautiful multiplicative effect, because you can multiply your whole user base by the incremental value that increases with each user. WeChat or Skype are classic communication network effects. So if I told you I just created Ravi Chat, and it's just as good as WeChat, and everybody here should go and download Ravi Chat, no one will, even though Ravi Chat is technically identical. Why? Because the whole network is already on WeChat. So even if I had a ripoff, even if somebody stole all of my IP and copied me, I'm still immune because of that network effect. Okay? So network effects are very powerful, and the way that network effects work is, you would never use Ravi Chat because no one's on the network. If you downloaded Ravi Chat, you would have no calls to make, because it's not a function of the technology which determines the number of calls. It's how many people are on the network. And so if there's one person on the network, if it's just you, you can make 0 calls. If there's 2 people, you can make 1 call. If there's a third person that gets added, that 1 call expands to 3 calls. There's 3 different types of calls that can be made. If there's 4 people, there's 6 calls. So every incremental add-on has a multiplicative effect on the value. The way that you can measure this is that there's different theories. There's Metcalfe's law, which says that the value is the square of the nodes, the number of individuals on the network. Some people would argue that it's even bigger than that it follows Reed's law, which is that the value is the number of subgroups and the permutations of subgroups you can create. But either way, it's very big. Okay, so. And just to show you why this is so profound, this is Facebook, which is the classic example of a network effect, or Metcalfe's law. And the red line down there is the number of monthly active users. Those are the number of users that have joined Facebook. And that is impressive, how quickly Facebook has grown with the red line. But the green line is revenues, okay? And so you can see that the revenues of Facebook grew exponentially, even though the users grew relatively linearly, which is an amazing thing. As a contrast, this is Angry Birds. Have you guys played, how many people have played Angry Birds? Okay. So Angry Birds is an amazing company. It's an amazing app that got built. But from Silicon Valley standards, many people would say that that was a phenomenon. It is not something that you can predict or bet on, because Angry Bird just grew by word of mouth, but there's no network effect in Angry Birds. So when I'm playing Angry Birds, that does not heighten your experience of the game. Does that make sense? Whereas when I join Facebook, it's another node in the system. So think about how you are building network effects. This is just an example of virality. Virality is a beautiful thing because it can spread, but virality is different than network effects, and you can measure network effects in different ways, but we won't go into that right now. So you can build network effects in a lot of different ways, but the basic principle is I want you to think about if there is a positive feedback loop where the output to some part of your business is an input to another part that produces an output that drives that first input, where something feeds on itself. So some examples are the network that we talked about. If you have a communication network, that's a multiplicative effect. If you have a marketplace where you have suppliers and providers, then that also creates a network effect where the buyers and the sellers need to be with each other. There's liquidity. You can also have an API or a developer platform. So every time somebody builds on top of Apple, an app on their app store, they bring in new users to Apple, and those other app developers also benefit from the new users that come in. So there's a multiplicative network effect in place there. And so these are all examples of big companies that have mastered network effects. Apple is a network effect across all three. You can have messaging on the iPhone. You can have the iTunes store, which is a marketplace. And then they have third parties that are building apps on top of Apple as well. OK. We won't go into this. Let me, I've got a couple minutes left, so let me send you one example. I'm going to skip through some of these slides, but I want to show you one thing that Jeff Moore did, where Jeff Moore, and this is really on the power of being a founder. Jeff Moore looked at the top performing companies in the United States over the last 10 years, and he benchmarked them against the market. And there are some companies that have done amazingly well. These companies outperform the market by twice. Microsoft, Intel, SAP. These companies outperformed the market by over 1.5x. Cisco, IBM, Adobe. These by over 3x. And these by over 4x. But there were two companies that absolutely killed the market, that outperformed by over 10x. Whereas the next best competitors were only 4x, which is still phenomenal. Does anybody know which those two companies are? Well, one is Apple, and the other is Amazon. And this was done during a period, I think, from 2004 to 2014 that Jeff's analysis was done. And the question is, why did Apple and Amazon do so well? All the stuff that I said, the network effects, they both do very, very profoundly well. Apple and Amazon have both built network effect-driven businesses. They've both built businesses on new technologies. And they're both very high, well, that's actually a good, I won't go into the margins. But yeah, so they both have built new technology, network effect-driven businesses. But what a lot of people would say is that the reason why Apple and Amazon did so well was because at the helm, during the height in their growth, the CEOs were the founders. You had Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos during that period that were at the helm of the companies. And that founders are agents of change. You had the smartest minds that money could buy in all the other organizations. But those minds that graduated from the top on-paper caliber schools could not compete with the founders, including Steve Jobs, who was a college dropout. And the reason why is because the founder mentality, the ability to take risk, to go into new markets is what creates companies that constantly change themselves. And both Apple and Amazon have evolved, where they're no longer the companies that they started with. Apple was originally a computing company. Now they're the biggest phone company, the biggest music company, and they're getting into everything else, TVs and so forth. Amazon went from being an online bookstore to the biggest utility computing company to they're now owning the home endpoint. And so both of those companies were amazing at their ability to reinvent themselves. And so that's my hope and my wish for you, is that I do hope and I wish that you can invoke your inner Jeff Bezos, your inner Steve Jobs, and take risks when other people will tell you not to, because you can trust what is happening internally. And with those risks, calibrate them by thinking about what you need to do to survive in the short term, but then thinking about the drivers to make them long-term Archimedes levers that change the world. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Ravi.